I know Indigenous people in academia, we're still not as prevalent as maybe a lot of our communities want us to be in these spaces.
Even for doing research, right? I mean, working with a community, there's a lot of the work in the research that is not really publishable in the academic sense. Right. Now, the Kiowa community is really open as far as language ownership goes, and so it's not really a case where the materials are restricted. Mm-hmm. But if I make a little guidebook to help people understand something that's not really for an academic audience,
right?
Then when I'm trying to convince people to hire me or promote me or something, who might not be in linguistics at all, right? That doesn't really speak to them the way that say another article in a journal would. And so, in a sense, I can't simply just produce work for an academic community.
Right.
The work has to be also accessible for the Kiowa community. Otherwise, there's not really a lot of point to it. Right. At least from my standpoint. From the administrators or from the field standpoint or from that sort of thing. I end up with this kind of, like I said, doing it wrong, where I might have a lot of interesting or valuable materials, but then who are they valuable for?
Right. I think that's a real commonality with a lot of, I would even say, just people of color's work in academia. How is it going to help my home community? How is it not going to be another gate to be kept, especially for these like academic institutions that historically haven't been on a lot of people's sides, who are marginalized. And so I think that's something that I will probably be hitting on this whole month is like how work that Indigenous peoples do in the college is accessible for their home community. And I don't think we have an answer yet as a whole.
Yeah. I know in linguistics, there is almost a divide between people who work specifically at that last step, like making things, doing things in communities directly, and then something that's more research oriented, that's more theoretically oriented. And so my work tends to be theoretically oriented. So and there's not really anyone doing the other side. So my work has to incorporate that.
Right.
So I end up doing being in two worlds again, basically.
Right.
And increasingly, though, at least in my field, I think there's a strong awareness of the value of that kind of work.
Right.
And so I do get a lot of support from my department and from granting agencies and from people in the field, in part because we see what happens when these when Indigenous languages are not maintained. Right. We see that really closely.
It's a lot of communities seem to be clamoring for their languages to not only be preserved but more revitalized is the way I kind of look at it.
Yeah. Are
you seeing any other efforts like kind of similar to that around here at KU or maybe in the surrounding area for Indigenous languages?
Actually, so I know at Oklahoma there is specifically an MA in language revitalization.
Really?
And it's a bit messy on the political side because it's got one foot in linguistics and one in anthropology, but the degree itself is fine.
Right.
So for the student, that doesn't affect the students so much. It's more of like professors sniping at each other. But the which is another thing. When I went into academia, it was completely over my head. I had no. I advise people to think about those things. And then I know that at the University of Montana there's also one as well, and I've sent students there actually,
really?
Graduates from here, and they work a lot with the Blackfoot community.
Okay.
And so I don't know if they've branched out to work with the Crow yet, but it's partly because the main linguist at U of Montana have worked on Blackfoot for a long time.
Right.
And then at Minnesota, they're also revamping their curriculum to include a lot more working with Indigenous communities. And then at KU, we don't have a master's program like that. Ours is still more oriented towards doing fundamental research. So kind of figuring out what there is to revitalize, if you will. And so, and my research is focused on that for Kiowa, and has found that there's a lot of very intricate, subtle things, and then able to kind of tease these out, and then put them in a way. And then the next step is to distill that in a way that a teacher could teach it, or because I can talk to elders who speak, and it's like, yeah, that makes sense. Okay, that's yeah, you got it, right? But then you try to teach someone, and then you get to the learning curve. But so MIT was peculiar because MIT led the field of linguistics. It had led the field of linguistics away from documenting Indigenous languages in the 50s and 60s. And so it was kind of ironic that they also kind of led the kind of new wave in linguistics of studying these languages to see what they contribute to our understanding of language. Right. Because they often work very differently from the languages English and Spanish and so forth. And and so MIT does that. A number of programs in California do that as well. New Mexico has one as well. And these are increasing over and over, all over the place. And part of that is because the federal government has actually promoted these kinds of efforts. And there's a lot more research money and foundational money for that kind of research.
I wasn't really sure that there was much of a federal push on that scale, and I don't think maybe a lot of people know that. I think that's something really interesting to think about for any listeners, that if you're a prospective high school student, maybe looking into Indigenous linguistics is something you can do. So as a linguist, I feel like you kind of wear a lot of hats at once. You're kind of doing historical work, and you're doing the work obviously within the language and the structure of the language. So you see these kinds of institutional efforts, like we're talking about, like MIT, as being maybe kind of detrimental to languages on some scale. What is your opinion of displacement's effect on language, like maybe the Trail of Tears or other displacement movements throughout the country?
In general, what we find is that language is pretty tough.
Right.
And what we've observed particularly with the tribes that were relocated to Oklahoma, that their languages did very well in that sense afterwards. Granted, one of the easiest ways to threaten a language is to eliminate the speakers.
Right.
And the Trail of Tears was effective for that. But among the survivors, they were able to forge their own lives, and then their languages continued in that sense. Right. They did end up diverging from the languages in that amongst the communities that stayed in the East, but I would say displacement itself isn't really necessarily a major factor in language survival. More daunting factors are for policy-wise would be things like the boarding schools. Those were much more effective in that sense, because they broke the chain of acquisition.
Right.
And once children stop picking up the language, that's where a language becomes endangered, and then that's where it becomes much more difficult to revitalize.
Right.
And even today, all these revitalization efforts are targeting children.
Right.
Right, because children can do these, feats of acquisition in ways we don't know how children do this, right? And then after on top of the boarding schools, you had a lot of death from displacement, also epidemics,
right,
wars, genocides, basically everything. And then you have the boarding schools deliberately targeting them. And then you had, after that, just the economic pressures that come with assimilation.
Right.
And so when you go down this list of everything that could harm the health and status of a language, almost every American Indian language underwent every single one of those.
Right.
Repeatedly for a very long time. And so it's a testament to how strong languages can be that they're alive at all.
Right.
Even now. And so, and a lot of them are still hanging on by a thread. So,
I have noticed that, and it seems, it may be the some of us who aren't necessarily like couched in the linguistic field, whenever we hear about languages, we always seem to hear of them on the verge. We never seem to hear of like any talk of them as they're being revitalized. And I think that's kind of it seems a little defeatist. I really feel for like the Osages and some of those relatives who are, they're working with other groups who had a very similar like linguistic pattern. I think maybe the Omahas and the Ponkas,
right?
Yeah. And so that I think is an opportunity. Maybe a lot of people don't realize. Like a lot of tribes maybe have a similar language structure or interacted, and so there can be revitalization efforts coming from that kind of perspective too.
Yeah.
Do you see anything else like that happening around?
So you mean like where communities are essentially, or different tribes are working together,
right?
In that sense, not a whole lot of that. Simply, I mean, part of that is just due to the nature of tribal government, and then
for sure.
That sort of thing. And then you get some issues. So some language families have more affinities. So, for instance, the Numic groups,
right.
so like Comanche and Shoshone and Ute, those languages are very obviously similar to each other, and there's some cultural links as well. But for something like Kiowa, linguistically, you can show that it's related to the Tanoan languages of New Mexico, but culturally,
right,
there's no historical remembrance of any link on either side. So there's not really a sense of working together or anything like that.
Right.
It's one. I think one thing where I do see a lot of people collaborating are different bands within the same community. So I know the Mohawks have managed to do a lot of work with different reservations that often have different dialects, and then they've managed to create a pretty strong curriculum actually over the years.
Right.
You were talking about a case of that's beyond the verge. The Mohawk case, there's already a K-12 curriculum for immersion, and some of the children that have gone through that are now having their own children and raising them in Mohawk and so forth. So, but their efforts started in the 1970s.
Right.
Right. And so these things take a while to bear fruit, and then the question is, will they bear fruit in time?
Right.
Yeah.
I think that key word there is immersion, right? That is, I don't have the studies in front of me or anything, but I feel like I've heard a lot of immersion is the best way to learn a language, right? And so from my personal experience, again, with like the Lakota people, I grew up, we would have books and stuff, and we would like recite, and the lessons that actually stuck with me from K through 12 were the stuff like I talked with my dad about, you know.
Right.
Is that, I know there's probably nothing like that right now, but maybe working with tribes to like say, these are the better ways to go about getting your language.
Well, no, and
together.
say if you took an MA in language revitalization, you would learn about all these different
Right.
techniques, right? One of the ones that is becoming more common, although it's resource intensive, is what's called the mentor relationship. And essentially, you live with a speaker. It's almost a one-on-one sort of thing.
Right.
And if they're an elder, you might live with them, help them out, and that sort of thing. And then, but then you spend all your time speaking in the language that you're studying, right? And so you get this intensive immersion environment, and this works a little bit better when you have an adult learner,
Right.
and a number of communities have done this. I know that the Creek, for instance, have recently, with a federal grant, set up a number of these relationships and trying to get a next generation of teachers,
Right.
of speakers who could teach the language as well. But because it's a one-on-one situation, or maybe one-on-two, it's very difficult to do that on a large scale.
Right.
But for the smaller scale, the immersion is, generally, just in general, immersion works, especially with younger people, but even with adults, if you move somewhere and you're surrounded by this other language and you're using it all the time,
Right.
Just the habit of using it will boost your language learning.